Well, isn't it interesting regarding all the events going on in the Ukraine? Ukraine. Uh, Evidently, it's not enough to have regime change in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, um, possibly in Syria. No, no, of course not. All this warmongering going on simply continues apace. And the American news media is awash with a nude talk of yet another war on some horizon. Well, it's probably not all that serious, and all this sensationalism being peddled around is probably, as usual, completely overblown, in this case in particular. But let me share with you some excerpts from an article in The Guardian, interspersed, with some of my own opinions on the matter. But here it goes. Both John Kerry's threats to expel Russia from the G8 and the Ukrainian government's plea for NATO aid marks a dangerous escalation of a crisis that can be easily contained if cool heads prevail. Hysteria seems to be the mood in Washington and in Kiev, with a new Ukrainian prime minister claiming we are on the brink of disaster, as he calls up army reserves in response to Russian military movements in Crimea. Were he talking about the country's economic plight, he would have a point. I have something to add to that later, actually. Instead, along with much of the US and European media, he was over-dramatizing the developments in the East, where Russian speakers are understandably alarmed after the new Kiev authorities scrapped a law allowing Russians as the official language in their areas. They see it as proof that the anti-Russian ultra-nationalists from Western Ukraine who were the dominant force in last week's or last month's uprisings or insurrection, are still in control. And yes, they are very much in control. Kerry's rush to punish Russia and NATO's decision to respond to Kiev's call by holding a meeting of member states' ambassadors in Brussels today were mistakes, is what the author says. Ukraine, and this is true, Ukraine is not part of the alliance, the NATO alliance, and so none of the obligations of common defense come into play militarily. NATO should refrain from interfering in Ukraine by word and deed, and I agree with this author when he says this. The fact that it insists on getting engaged reveals the elephant in the room, and this is true. The underlying crises in Crimea and Russia's fierce resistance to potential changes is NATO's undisguised ambition to continue 2 decades of expansion into what used to be called the post-Soviet space, led by Bill Clinton and taken up by every successive administration in Washington. At the back of the Pentagon's minds, no doubt, is the dream that the US Navy will one day replace the Russian Black Sea Fleet in the Crimean port of Sevastopol. Yes, and that is the crux of the issue, because this is a much larger and dangerous geopolitical game being played out here. Unfortunately, with this rebellion in Kiev against the government, what has taken place is that the Ukrainian population has actually is jumping from the frying pan into the fire, proverbially. You know, needless to say, the interim prime minister, now in charge, just last week stated that he may be the most unpopular politician in Ukraine. This is after they pushed him into power, right? Having convinced the protesters that it's in their best interest to align itself exclusively with Western Europe and Western powers, any bailout, financial bailout by the IMF, will entail economic austerity measures, including a six-fold increase in the cost of heating oil and the slashing of all social programs, measures that will make the ordinary lives of ordinary Ukrainians even harder than what they are today. While the ousted Yanukovych, himself an oligarch to be sure, preferred a more measured and independent approach, approaching both sides, not just Russia, but also Europe to some degree. But let's be frank here. All these orange revolutions in Eastern Europe were financed by Western powers and with heavy involvement of the National Endowment for Democracy, which instigates anything but democracy wherever it leaves its fingerprints, or footprints, so to speak. Here's what Ray McGovern has to say about it. Is regime change in Ukraine the bridge too far for the neoconservative regime changers, official Washington, and their sophomoric responsibility to protect allies in the Obama administration? Have they dangerously overreached by pushing the putsch, in other words, coup, that removed duly elected Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych? Russian President Vladimir Putin has given an unmistakable yes to that question, in deeds, not just in words. His message is very clear: back off. Putin described this move as necessary to protect ethnic Russians and military personnel stationed in Crimea in the southern Ukraine, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet and other key military installations are situated. In other words, Russia has very important military, strategic, and geopolitical interests in that region. And these interests are legitimate as far as they are concerned. And basically, I can't blame them. If the situation were reversed, let's say an alliance of a military alliance of the Russian Federation came too close to our borders here in the United States, I think we would take a counteraction, don't you think? So this is what's happening there. Basically, it should have been a no-brainer, McGovern goes on, that Russia would use military force if necessary to counter attempts to use economic enticement and subversive incitement to slide Ukraine into the orbit of the West and eventually into NATO, because that is really the bigger plan. This was all the more predictable in the case of Ukraine, where Putin, although now, of course, he's the bête noire in the corporate Western media, holds very high strategic cards, geographically, militarily, economically, and politically. We know that thanks to the neocon prima donna Victoria Nuland, now Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, who seemed intent of giving new dimensions to the cookie-pushing role of U.S. diplomats. Recall the photo showing Nuland in a metaphor of overreach excuse me, as she reached deep into the large plastic bag to give an anti-government demonstrator on the square in Kiev a cookie before the putsch. More importantly, recall her amateurish, boorish use of open telephone to plot regime change in Ukraine with a fellow neocon, U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pratt. Crass U.S. interference in Ukrainian affairs can be seen, actually, on YouTube videos. It's been recorded. Nuland was recorded as saying, Yats is the guy. He's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know. Yats will need all the help he can get to stave off the collapse of the ex-Soviet state. He has warned that there's an urgent need for unpopular cutting of subsidies and social payments before Ukraine can improve. And guess what? The stopgap government formed after the coup designated Nuland's guy, Yats. In other words, Yatsenuk is now the interim prime minister. What luck! Yats is 39 and has served as the head of the central bank, foreign minister, and economic minister. And as a designated pinch hitter prime minister, he has already talked about the overriding need for responsible government, one willing to commit political suicide, as he put it, by taking very unpopular social measures. In other words, the Ukrainians are about to get screwed once again. I mean, it just can't get any more obvious. As far as the economic isolation of Russia is concerned, the U.S. foreign policy establishment may want to think twice about how this is apt to play out. As far as I know, there are quite a few Western European nations who now depend on the gas and oil of Russia. So basically, Russia is also then in the position, being threatened themselves with economic isolation, to merely turn off that spigot for a while. So this is not this is not as easy as the Western media makes it sound. And, as far as the media regarding direct military confrontation between NATO forces and the Russian military is concerned, that's probably a bit overblown. Since this time, they're actually dealing with an armed nuclear power and not some country with non-existent weapons of mass destruction. Of course, for Kerry to exclaim that this is an incredible act of aggression based on a trumped-up pretext is laughable on its face, coming from a man who fully supported the invasion of Iraq, and then, with no sense of irony, calls for Putin to respect the democratic process through which the Ukrainian people ousted the pro-Russian president and assembled a new government. I think it's a bit of a stretch to call violent protests which have taken place in Kiev a democratic process when it was actually Yanukovych who was elected by the whole of the Ukrainian people. We in the West should remember this. Of course, not to be outdone in inflammatory rhetoric was, as always, Senator Lindsey Graham in immediately calling for NATO intervention, in other words, an open military confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia. Brilliant. Just brilliant. What's even more perplexing is that the vast majority of Americans are once again falling hook and sinker behind the endless warmongering of our mass media. This after knowing that they have been lied to over and over again. Amazing. Simply amazing. And just as a little side note, speaking of that Ambassador Nuland, and You may also want to recall that Ambassador Nuland's husband is Robert Kagan, one of the biggest neocons around. And he was one of the co-founders of the project of the New American Century. Nice, huh? So, this is what we're dealing with here. This is what we're dealing with. And like I say, most Americans, knowing that they've been lied to by the mass media, are falling for this shit once again. I don't know what else to say. Good night.